What we know, if you actually go into high poverty schools, high performing schools, low performing schools, if you disaggregate the impact of the quality and the effectiveness of the teachers within the schools, you actually see extremely wide variation. In other words, even in a low performing school, you will see a highly effective teacher right next to a very low impact teacher. And what that means to me, and what that really means for all of us in education, is that we need to figure out how to bridge that gap. And the answer, I think, is not only recruiting more teachers that have skills and abilities, but it's also figuring out how to transfer that knowledge, those skills and abilities, from the high impact teacher to the low impact teacher, so that we get across the school an increase in teaching effectiveness. Right now we're only looking at it as an individual ability. That's the wrong way to go. We need to look at increasing teaching at scale.
So more mentoring?
That's right, mentoring. Actually having teachers share what works in their classroom with the colleague that has their door closed. That's not acceptable anymore. As we're talking about communities in schools, we actually need to have communities among the professionals as well.
Well, Yvette, along the same lines, what are school systems and teachers going to need to do differently to raise the standards in English and language arts?
Well, you know, as René was speaking, I was thinking about one of the things that we've been doing, and it flows into the English and language arts, is we have been including, as I said earlier, I think, students in the professional development with their teachers. Now, why I share that with you, what is so neat, is that as René was talking about those high impact teachers, our students are being trained in different kinds of pedagogical teaching approaches. They are then advertising, especially in Newark where we've been doing this, those students then advertise to other teachers that they will come into their classrooms. They actually have blogs and they say, we know that you're working on vocabulary, or we know that you're working on narrative skills, language arts, the whole area, or informational reading. We'd love to come into your classroom and show you some strategies that your students will love to learn how to do. Now I just wanted to add that because that, I think, is a really novel approach, first of all, for building the self-direction of learning for those students who are involved in this kind of PD with their professional development, with their teachers, because they get out there, they learn much more about learning, but they read much more. So when you say, what are we going to have to do about English language arts, we've got to get students reading much more. And one of the things that we know works is when you're building that reading around what's very interesting to them and how they see applications. What's the current events? What's the world doing outside? They want to read about those things. But back to specifics now, one of the things that we have found is that there's not enough professional learning around language itself. There's professional learning around teaching of reading, but reading is based on language development. And I mean looking at etymology, looking at morphology, looking at how you get into deep discussion about issues that might come up that are, I'll go back to the idea of theories and philosophy. If the standards are asking that students read more deeply and be able to interpret text, then you've got to put them in the opportunity where they are literally interpreting. Now, I say it that way because what we're forgetting often is that when you ask somebody to interpret something, it's your interpretation. There can't be a right or wrong to that. What you're really saying is that students should be able to summarize better, they should be able to paraphrase. What I'm saying is that the whole approach to English language arts has to be more of an integration of looking at how the idea of helping students engage much more in speaking is going to affect their reading, because it will affect their vocabulary and it will affect their interpretation. Things like Socratic method, things like there's a program that used to be out, and I think it still is, called Junior Great Books, which is all around deep discourse around themes. That's what we need more of, and connecting language development to those themes that they're working on.
What do you feel is the greatest promise of the new Common Core state standards?
The greatest promise is the belief that our students who are in poverty schools, are going to be college and career ready. That's the promise. That is the thing that makes me excited, that people are now saying, we're not going to accept just annual yearly progress where they've grown 1 or 2 years in reading, but these children are going to be ready for college. The implication is they will go to college. The implication is they have the ability to do that. That's the greatest promise for me, to change the belief about these children and to provide the opportunities so that they'll even think about college. So many of them, they don't even have that conversation. I think once a year they do career day, and maybe they talk about schools for these children. I know in the South what's really interesting, there's a lot of recruiting that goes on in the South for students to go into the armed forces. There's very little that's done to get students to go out and see, what does it mean to go to college? What do you do when you go to college? What's the promise of college? And that's what I'm hoping that the promise of these standards will bring with it.
Renee, rolling out something this comprehensive, it's going to have pitfalls. Which ones keep you up at night?
Well, I think the biggest pitfall that you can have is think that our job is done when we set these high standards. So if we stop there, we will have no change in practice, no change in outcomes. So I think if anything needs to be addressed, it is preparing the schools, the teachers, to actually implement these standards, which means transforming their own learning, transforming their own teaching so that students can achieve.
How is that going to translate to a veteran teacher? A lot of the emphasis of these core standards are on changing the way teachers teach. How are they going to react to this?
I have a lot of faith in teachers. Teachers have been calling since the early standards movement that they want to teach deeper, that they want students to engage students in this thinking process, the conceptual, not just the rote memorization. So I think that they're ready for it, but we need to support them in doing that because it is going to be different than what they've been doing in the past. And so if we set up these systems where teachers can collaborate, they can learn how to do it, but they can also practice it in a safe environment and transfer their knowledge from teacher to teacher, we actually will have the results that we're expecting.
Are colleges preparing the new teachers for these core standards?
I think that transformation is slowly happening. We need more of that, but I want to emphasize that even though we are going to have a major shift in retirements, in teachers leaving the profession, we also need to remember that 80% of the workforce is stable. If we're not tackling that 80% and supporting them to continuously improve, we're not going to get the results that we want from our students.
What keeps me up at night is the reality that students in poverty areas have lives outside of school that really affect what goes on in school. You know, as I mentioned, one of the places we work in is Newark, New Jersey, and there, in certain areas, there's a lot of crime that happens, and I can't tell you how many times the students will be, because I happen to work with students myself too. I had the great pleasure of teaching there as well as I do this job, but how often a police siren will go by or an ambulance, and these students are thinking about, is that somebody I know? What gang just got into trouble? That kind of stress that these students go through lets off cortisol in the body that really breaks down their comprehension. So what keeps me up at night is, in relation to building on the standards, will there be an understanding that you have to address what happens for students outside? And what I mean by that is, you can't take care of them outside, but what you can do is offer them this oasis where people recognize they might be in stress. They can be doing relaxation exercises in school. That sounds really crazy, but we have a school we work with in San Francisco that does just that, and the growth of the students has really been enormous. And so what I'm saying is that when we think about these high poverty schools, we have to think about giving those students the kind of enrichment, the support, the deep discussion and mediation, as I said earlier, that they're not getting at home. You can't just be saying we're going to teach more deeply, but what does that mean in reference to their life outside? How do you bridge the relevance and meaningfulness for them and their past experiences as being important.
Right. Yvette, René,
you.
thank you so much for joining us on Spotlight.
Thank you very much.